Dr. John DePoe is the assistant professor of philosophy at Marywood University in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He teaches and publishes on the theory of knowledge, metaphysics, and the philosophy of religion. He earned his PhD from my home state in the University of Iowa, so I was pretty impressed with that right off the bat. He has an MA in philosophy from Western Michigan State, an MA in religion from Hardin-Simmons, and that's also where he got his BA, where he double majored in philosophy and theology. Now, I have to, if you were here last night, I actually attributed his wife and children to Mike Lacconi yesterday. So, again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to do what I do. But he and his wife, Jeannie, they are the ones that have two young daughters, Phoebe and Lydia. I think you're really going to be happy to hear from John. I think he's going to be able to really help you get a grasp of some of the philosophical arguments for the existence of God. So why don't you give me a warm welcome for Dr. John DePoe. Thanks so much, brother. So glad to have you here.
Well, thank you all for this invitation. Thank you for coming out on a Saturday to think about your faith. For those of you that might be seekers, to take some time to think about the important claims of Christianity. When I got a call from Rich about this, they said, we want you to go over and talk about these arguments for the existence of God. There are these three important ones. And I was sitting there going, this is great. Can I have 3 hours for it? And they said, try, 45 minutes. So what I've tried to do is put together something that will get your interest and to see some value and to show you the basic structure of some of these arguments. But this is just skin deep. There is so much more to this. What I'll be talking about is looking at things that come from the universe and from consciousness. And I'm going to try my best to make this a little more engaging than my metaphysics classes that'll run sometimes 3 hours on Wednesday nights. And see if we can bring you to a place to see that there is good evidence out there for the existence of God, that you might find this will bring you to look at some resources that will help you communicate this to friends. For those that are seeking, you might go a little deeper to look for answers on this question. I've put together a little roadmap to keep me in line. We're going to start off by just talking very briefly why the question matters. And I can keep this real brief because this has been covered very well already by especially Joe earlier. To those of you that believe in God, this question matters because you've been told in Scripture to always be prepared to give a defense of the hope that is within you. So this is really important for you to be obedient in your walk with God. It also gives you great confidence to share your faith with others. As has already been talked about, a lot of the times the reason we don't share our faith with other people is we're afraid, what if they ask something and I really have no clue what to say? Studying and being prepared in apologetics will give you the ability to go confidently and share your faith. Something else I want to stress is that God is the author of both Scripture, but He's also the author of nature, of the universe, of your minds. In theological terms, we talk about this in terms of special revelation and general revelation. Special revelation is Scripture. He revealed Himself directly through God's Word. But He's also revealed things about Himself through His work in creation, in making the world the way it is, and creating you the way that you are. And Scripture tells us about this. Psalm 19 it begins with this beautiful way of describing how God has created the heavens and the earth, and they cry out and describe what kind of creator He is. In Romans chapter 1, this has already been talked about, but it talks about how people are without excuse because God has revealed Himself and the kind of God He is through nature. For those of you who are not believers, The first point I want to bring up is that, isn't this just a fascinating question? It doesn't matter. We like to know how stuff works. We want to figure things out. And the question of is there a God? Why are we here? How did we get here? How did the universe come to be? These are just fascinating questions that I think we're all interested in knowing the answer to, no matter what walk of life we come from. The other thing is that, to put this in some philosophical terms, answering this question is both momentous, meaning it's of great importance. Joe talked about this morning, that whether you believe in God or not has enormous consequences. It's a momentous choice, and it's also a forced choice, meaning you can't avoid it. Because to put off answering the question is essentially to say you don't believe. So you can't avoid answering this. Not answering it is to essentially answer it. This is C.S. Lewis. He was a Cambridge professor, a very influential Christian. He came to know Christ later in his life as a result of looking into the evidence. This is one way that he tries to encourage people to think about the question, does God exist? He says, here is a door behind which, according to some people, the secret of the universe is waiting for you. Either that's true or it isn't. And if it isn't, then what the door really conceals is simply the greatest fraud, the most colossal sell on record. Isn't it obviously the job of every man to try to find out which, and then to devote his full energies either to serving this tremendous secret or to exposing and destroying this gigantic humbug? What I want to take you through is to begin to take us through what I think is one of the most important questions that we need to think about. And if these are good reasons to believe in God, you should take these reasons and show this to your friends, because it's this important. Now, the first argument I want to go through is what's commonly called the cosmological argument. And this gorgeous man is G.W. Leibniz. He comes from an era, you might think this is the 1980s. This is actually the 17th, 18th century. Leibniz is a genius beyond compare to anyone that we have ever met. He invented calculus. You might say, didn't Newton do that? Actually, they invented it independently at the exact same time. Leibniz said, the first question which should rightly be asked is this: why is there something rather than nothing? And Leibniz, by the way, believes in God. He's a Christian. He thought that this was the first and most important question because it leads to some of the most important things in life. So cosmological arguments focus on this question: why is there something rather than nothing? How did we get here? You say, well, Honda Civic. But why are we here in this larger sense? Why is there a universe at all? Couldn't there have been a different universe than this one? Couldn't it have been the case there was no universe at all? A little bit of terminology needs to come into place before we can really appreciate the force of the argument. So there's one kind of term, which is a contingent being, and then there's another kind of term which refers to a necessary being. A contingent being is one whose existence is contingent, meaning that it could exist or it could not exist, that it could be one way or it could be another way. It didn't have to be. The existence of a contingent being, we say, is contingent because it is dependent on certain things coming into play, certain factors, certain causes, certain conditions. You are a contingent being. You did not have to exist. Your existence is the result of certain causes and conditions coming together in just the right way. It has to do with your parents. Beyond that, I'm not going to say. The existence of this building is a contingent fact. It's a contingent being. Why? Because this building did not have to exist. It exists because certain people made certain decisions, because of construction crews, because of materials that were put into place. It has an existence that is dependent on other things for its existence. The comparison, the contrary to that, is a necessary being. This would be the kind of being that must exist. This is a being whose existence is independent of causes and conditions, who does not depend on other things in order to exist at all. And maybe another way to orient our question, why is there something rather than nothing? Here's another way to think about this. Is it possible that everything that exists is contingent? Could it be the case that everything comes into existence because of prior causes and conditions? Now, one thing to think about with this, I'm going to be talking about the universe through this part of the talk. When I talk about the universe, I don't mean this room. I don't mean the United States. I don't mean the planet Earth. I don't mean our solar system. I don't mean the Milky Way galaxy. I mean all things that are connected in space and time. So it would be everything that exists in the material world. Is it possible that everything in the universe is a contingent being? Well, we can look at this question maybe by answering it in two ways. One, we could say, I'll get to that in a second. Here's the whole argument. So the first premise, in philosophy we kind of like to lay things out in premises and conclusion. And I've made this simple by giving you two premises, and then the third claim is the conclusion. The first claim is an either-or statement. Either A, there is a necessary being that exists that is the ultimate cause for everything else that exists. Or B, everything that exists is contingent. What I'm going to go to in the next slide is trying to show you that 2 is impossible. It doesn't just happen to be the case that 2 is false. 2 couldn't possibly be true. And therefore, there must be a necessary being that is the ultimate cause for everything that exists. Now, why think premise 2 is true? The reason why we can think premise 2 is true is that there's really two ways to look at this. You could think that the universe, on the one hand, has a finite temporal beginning. Now, why might somebody even think this? Well, our best science actually tells us this. This is what the Big Bang Theory teaches, is that the universe has not been eternal and infinite. And when you look at the history of science, when this theory emerged and came into great prominence in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, many scientists fought against this tooth and nail because of its theistic implications. If the universe has a finite temporal beginning, then the first moment in time is a contingent event. That is, that it has no cause or explanation for why it exists. Think about this. Dominoes. When one domino falls over because another one hits it, it didn't have to fall. Its falling was the result of prior causes and conditions, namely the other domino hitting it. It wouldn't have fallen unless the other domino hit it. If every event in the universe is contingent, it's like the falling of the domino, which would mean that if we're looking at a series of dominoes that are falling this way, and we look at this one and say, why did it fall? Well, because the previous one hit it. And why did that one fall? Because the previous one hit it. If the universe has a temporal beginning, we're going to come to a domino at the very beginning of the series, and we're going to say, now why did that one fall? And if it's contingent and you have no reason why it fell, then you just say, magic. That is not a good reason to think the first domino falls. So this is an obvious non-starter. So many atheists then want to turn around and say, well, wait a minute, let me instead go with the idea that even though science doesn't say this, maybe in 1,000 years they'll change their minds and say that the universe is infinite and beginningless. So think about a series of dominoes that doesn't have a beginning. So we don't have that first domino at the end, it just goes on forever. Or another kind of example I like to use of this is boxcars. Imagine you're sitting at a railroad crossing and it's just taking forever, right? It's just one boxcar after the other. I've got a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old is getting to that stage of like wanting to know, why do things happen? What is that, Daddy? And it's, bless her heart, she thinks that I know everything. Sometimes I think I know everything. And then my wife corrects me. The idea here, if you're looking at all these boxcars, one pushing the other, even if it's taking a long time, you could say, now why is this boxcar moving? Because the previous one pushes it. And why is that one moving? Because the previous one pushes it. And why is that one moving? Because the previous one. Could that go on infinitely? Could that go on forever? I think if you think carefully about the dominoes or the boxcars that are moving in this way, the answer is no. It couldn't just go on forever. You would need to introduce, even if there were an infinite series of boxcars, one pushing the other, which pushes the other, which pushes the other, you would still need to introduce a different kind of motion into that series. Something that moves without being moved by something else. Right. You need to, in the series of dominoes, you need to have something that causes dominoes to fall without itself being caused to fall. If the universe is infinite and beginningless, then the universe as a whole, that whole infinite and beginningless series of events, would be without cause or explanation for why it is. Think about this. When we think about contingent events, we're thinking about things that either could have been or could not have been. By creating an infinite series of things, all of which either could have been or could not have been, it doesn't explain why they're all there. It doesn't explain why it's in this order, why it's not some other way. Now, atheists who've studied this argument will often think that what I just did here commits a fallacy in reasoning. This is called the fallacy of composition. They said, wait a minute, what you just said doesn't sound true. What you said is that because every single part of the universe is contingent, the whole thing is contingent. Gotcha. Now, what I want to say is that when we talk about the fallacy of composition, we're saying that the whole thing has a certain feature because all of the parts have that feature. So you might think the starting 5 players for the Miami Heat are all individually better players than the starting 5 for the San Antonio Spurs, my favorite team. So you might think, therefore, the team of the Miami Heat is better than the team of the San Antonio Spurs. And it's true, the Miami Heat, they have bigger named all-stars, but it doesn't necessarily mean as a team they're a bit bigger, better team. Or maybe take a different example. In this room, nobody in this room weighs more than 600 pounds. But it would be false then to say that the totality of all persons in this room taken together does not weigh more than 600 pounds. So that's what they're saying I'm doing in this argument, is I'm saying that every individual part of the universe is contingent, and it would be false for me to say the whole thing is contingent. Here's the deal with the fallacy of composition. It is what we call an informal fallacy. So for those of you that are interested in logic and reason, this is a really cool thing. There's a difference between formal fallacies and informal ones. Formal fallacies are the type such that whenever it meets a certain form, you've made a mistake in reasoning. Informal fallacies are the kinds of fallacies that depend on the content. That sometimes they're fallacies, but sometimes they're not. So, whether I've committed a fallacy or not here depends upon the content of what I'm saying. In this case, the content clearly justifies the idea that the universe as a whole is contingent. Just because every single part of the universe is contingent, nowhere does that then explain or show that the universe as a whole exists necessarily, or that it could not have existed, or that it had to exist this way and no other possible way. And that's what you have to get out of this argument. So the argument, I think, is a good one, that it shows that given our alternatives, that either there is a necessary being that is the cause of everything else, or everything is contingent, that it's clearly the case that everything is not contingent. It couldn't possibly be the case that everything is contingent. Therefore, there has to be something necessary. Now, you might say, so what? You showed me something is necessary. I thought, these guys coming up here earlier have been talking about Jesus and the Bible. What does all this philosophy have to do with that? Well, I think that when we think about what kinds of things do we have to say about the cause of the universe, that it nice and neatly lines up with things that the Bible teaches. For instance, it shows us that this necessary being is not to be identified with the universe itself, but is something separate and different in kind from the universe. It can't be the same kind of thing that we find that makes up the universe. It says that this necessary being depends on nothing else for its existence. That this being is not the kind of being that exists because anything else made it exist. So that whatever brought this universe into existence does not depend on anything else for its own existence. This necessary being would have to be exceptionally powerful, that there would be no other way to bring a big, beautiful universe like ours into existence out of nothing without being incredibly powerful. So that's the cosmological argument. Here's a second one I want you to think of. This is called the design argument. There's a lot of different forms of this. Joe gave a couple of different suggestive ideas about fine-tuning, DNA, the location of the planet Earth. I've got another one I want to show you about this. Design arguments, they take their cue from the beauty, the order, and the purposeful attributes found in nature. And people ask, why does the universe have these attributes? Why is it this way? I'm kind of a science geek. My PhD is in philosophy. I've done master's degrees in religion, but I've always really been fascinated by science. You know that the universe is composed of approximately 10 to the 80th power of fundamental particles. Now, 10 to the 80th power, that's a number we can't even begin to fathom. That's a 10 with 80 zeros after it. I would just be happy if I could get, a paycheck with like 6 zeros, right? Think about what that even means, 10 to the 80th power. It's a number that is so large we can't even begin to imagine what that even means. That's how many electrons, bosons, leptons, photons, quarks. If you look in a standard physics textbook, you might find a chart like this. These are the different fundamental particles by classification. There's 17 of them. Some of them don't have the number, lucky 17 there hanging off the edge, the Higgs boson. That's a relatively new guy in science. But everything that exists in the universe, every material thing that exists in the universe, is composed out of this stuff. Think of those things as like building blocks, as Legos. That it would be like if you showed up and we discovered everything was made out of Legos. But maybe at first we didn't realize things were made out of Legos, right? Like we just showed up someplace and we saw trees, and we just thought a tree was a basic thing. Then we discovered you could break trees apart. And then you break the trees parts apart. And you could break those parts apart, but at the very bottom, everything turned out to be Legos. Kind of like that world. Now, on this kind of model, if we want to make it like this, imagine there's just 17 types of Legos. and that's it. Every single fundamental particle is perfectly similar to every single other one that is of the same kind. I wonder, why is this the case? I mean, isn't it suspicious that every single fundamental particle falls into one of these 17 kinds? Couldn't each fundamental piece of the universe, each basic building block, have been as different as a snowflake or as different as a set of fingerprints? How did they all, this unfathomable number, how did they all turn out to be just like these 17 kinds in exact similarity? This is Richard Swinburne. He is a distinguished professor at a little school called Oxford University. He believes in God and has written very powerful defenses of the existence of God. He got me thinking about this with an analogy that he wrote in a book. And this is his analogy. He says, if all the coins found on an archaeological site have the same markings, or all the documents in the room with the same characteristic handwriting, we look for an explanation in terms of a common source. The apparently coincidental cries out for explanation. So now come back to thinking about the world in terms of Legos. If the world consists of all these 10 to the 80th power number of particles, they all are exactly falling into these 17 kinds of pieces where they are perfect matches to one another. Isn't that a little suspicious? Couldn't they have all been different? And the other thing that's really cool, like Legos, you can combine the little ones to create bigger ones, you can combine to create even bigger ones, which you can combine to create bigger things. Quarks were one of these things on the fundamental particle chart. You can use these things to create hadrons and baryons. You can use those to create protons and neutrons. You can use those with electrons to create atoms. You can use those to create our familiar objects on the periodic table of elements. You use those things to create rocks and natural objects and those sorts of things. You use those things to create planets. Use all of those things to create solar bodies. Use those things to make solar systems, which make up galaxies. And it's really fascinating. If those 17 particles were not able to be combined and put together in these exact ways, we may have only been able to get that first level or the second level. But we wouldn't be able to get anything bigger than that. Imagine instead of those 17 Lego pieces, what if you had a couple Lego pieces, some Mega Blocks, and some Lincoln Logs? You're not going to be able to put together anything with all that stuff. But we have a universe that is made out of all these kinds that fit together and create something larger. Here are your two explanations for this. We have a universe that was put that way because there is a God who values order, design, and beauty, and wanted to make a world that was intelligible and orderly in this way that would make possible all these bigger, larger things in life. Or, by sheer luck, a coincidence of the magnitude of 10 to the 80th power, we just happen to get all these particles that look like one another and fit together and create these bigger objects that we can live in. What would you think are the odds here? That we've got a grand coincidence or that it was done on purpose? I think the clear winner is theism, that this is no accident. Once again, if you think about the example, if you were digging in an archaeological site and you found 5 coins with the exact same markings, you wouldn't say, what are the odds? We just happen to get 5 coins that all have the exact same image and likeness, but what a coincidence. You'd say, no, it's that way on purpose. And for the same reason, I look at our universe and I think it's on purpose that it's this way. Now, somebody might say, but don't the laws of physics explain why all these particles are the same? That's a mistake, I think, because the laws of physics are nothing more than our abstract generalizations or expressions we come up with to describe the properties of physical objects. It's not like a law of physics can make anything happen. A law of physics explains or describes how things have the features that they have. So our abstract generalizations don't explain why physical objects have the specific properties they have. Rather, the properties of physical objects explains why those laws are correct in the generalizations that we give them. And for that reason, it doesn't really make any sense to say that the laws of nature explain the phenomena that needs to be explained here. So atheism asks us to accept a vast, unexplained coincidence to account for the order of our universe. And the order of our universe, though, is readily explained by supposing it was put there by design. Now, what else can we say about the designer of this universe? Well, this designer must value beauty, order, and intelligibility. This designer must be supremely powerful and intelligent to make this world this way. These are all things, once again, that Scripture tells us about this. Now, the third argument is what's called the argument from reason. And the way I want to introduce this is with a quote from a relatively smart guy named Albert Einstein. He said, "It would be possible to describe everything scientifically, but it would make no sense. It would be without meaning, as if you described a Beethoven symphony as a variation of wave pressure." Think about that. Is Beethoven's symphony, is that just, would you be telling the complete story about it if you just told the story about how the particles were compressed into waves and affected the air, which stimulated your nervous system to create this auditory experience? There's something missing in that. The way to frame this is to think about first this idea of naturalism. Naturalism is the most prominent and most widely accepted view of atheism in our age today. Naturalism is this kind of view that the natural world is the total picture. There's nothing more to the reality than nature. There's nothing outside, above, or beyond the events that take place in nature. And reality at its most fundamental level operates according to undesigned, non-purposive causes with no intended goal or direction. That nature is just operating at its most basic level, causing everything else to happen. This argument raises the question, is it rational to believe in naturalism? And I will try to argue in the time I have left, no. Before we get to that, you have to make a distinction between using the word because. We often say X occurs because of Y. There's two ways in which we use the word because. So in example A, we might have an example like this. Grandpa is ill today because he ate lobster yesterday. Or B, Grandpa must be ill today because he hasn't gotten up yet. Now the first statement is a statement about cause and effect. Cause and effect is not explaining anything rational. It's not like that the one thing implies the other thing. It's just that, by the clunky mechanics of the physical world, that thing caused the next thing to take place. But in the second one, it's not cause and effect. When we say, Grandpa must be ill today because he hasn't gotten up yet. Here we're talking about a relation of ground and consequent, meaning that you go from reasons to drawing an inference based on those reasons to a specific conclusion that is rationally implied. And this might sound abstract, but we do this every day. You're all capable of doing this. We're all born with the equipment for this. Try it out yourself. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Congratulations. It follows, right? The ideas imply a conclusion. Now, it's not reasonable to believe that naturalism is true because, according to naturalism, our ability to reason would have to be the result of cause and effect alone. That the things that take place on the level of brain chemistry are cause and effect, and that would have to be everything that exists, and your thoughts would just be byproducts of that cause and effect process. There would be no room for anything to be a result of ground and consequent, that ability to see how one thing follows from another. Here's C.S. Lewis again. He says, if naturalism were true, then all thoughts, whatever, would be wholly the result of irrational causes. Therefore, all thoughts would be equally worthless. Therefore, naturalism is worthless. If it is true, then we can know no truths. It cuts its own throat. Think about it like this. My parents are both computer programmers, and they've been programming computers since the 70s. You've probably heard of punch cards. I think this was referenced a little earlier. Would you fly in an airplane that had been programmed by people throwing punch cards on a football field, and then football players with spiked cleats running over those cards, then randomly shuffling the cards and feeding them in to program the landing sequence? No, you would not. If our minds are just the product of cause and effect, it's kind of like that. That our minds are not operating because there is reason that is behind it. It's just doing what it's been programmed to do by non-rational, non-purposive causes. Here's another diagram. So what I've got on the left side and the right side, think of those like two moments of time. On the left side, this is according to naturalism, your brain state causes, you'll see the cause and effect arrow going up. It causes you to have that mental state. All men are mortal and Socrates is a man. Then, because of the causal processes of the physical, chemical features of your brain, it would cause you to go into the second brain state, which then causes you to have this other mental state, which is then saying, Socrates therefore is mortal. If all that takes place is cause and effect here, then the first mental state is not related to the second mental state in a rational way. It's related to it in the same way that adding vinegar to baking soda causes the little eruption that all of our first graders do for their science projects. That's not a rational relationship. It's just cause and effect. One thing made the other thing take place. We don't get that top arrow that we're looking for, which is that the first one is logically related to the second one, and that's the basis for why we draw those inferences. Naturalism says it all has to take place on a cause and effect level. So my argument would boil down to this. Naturalism essentially excludes the possibility for beliefs to stand in ground and consequent relations. A necessary condition for beliefs to be rationally justified is for them to be able to stand in those ground and consequent relations. Therefore, naturalism cannot satisfy a condition for rationally justified beliefs. Any worldview that excludes rationally justified beliefs is self-defeating, because you'd have to say, I'm rationally justified in believing naturalism. That's why I'm a naturalist. Oh, wait, there's no such thing as rationally justified beliefs. Oops. Therefore, naturalism would have to be self-defeating. Let me draw some conclusions to all this. Well, we can draw a conclusion about the argument from reason and then draw some big picture conclusions here. If we are able to engage in reasoning, then naturalism is not true. What does that show? That shows that there is more to reality than just the physical, natural world. And all of you have firsthand evidence of that, because all of you can draw that inference that all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The best explanation for the existence of rational thinking processes is a personal mind who has created humans with his own rational nature. To get reason, you have to get it from a rational source. You can't get it from a non-rational source. So let me draw some big picture conclusions here. I've just gone over just the very basics of three arguments for the existence of God and said, let's put it on the line. Where does the balance of reason lie? Theism explains why the contingent universe exists. It explains it because it says there is such a thing as a necessary being. Atheism says that the contingent universe is an inexplicable mystery. They say everybody gets a couple mulligans. Our worldview is going to take a mulligan on why the universe exists. Secondly, theism says, well, we can explain the uniformity, the order of all the vast particles and properties that we find in the entire massive universe, and why those things can be used to create a beautiful, orderly universe. Atheists have to say that uniformity is a grand coincidence of a magnitude of 10 to the 80th power. Theism says our reasoning comes from a transcendent source that is not determined by cause and effect, whereas atheists have to say our thinking processes are luckily determined by cause and effect processes that take place in nature where there's no room for anything else. You decide which you think is the stronger case. And I think that is all I've got for y'all today. So check out the resources that we have on this. On the book tables, just about everybody's books touches on these topics. While I'm here, I'm plugging my book, or one part of this book. I've got an essay, and this book talks about almost all these topics as well. Look around and see if you want to go deeper. We want to give you those resources.